Hello everyone and welcome to my channel Y&R Trends. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Victor Newman had weathered countless storms throughout his life, corporate betrayals, romantic upheavals, family wars, and tragedies that would have broken lesser men. But nothing, not even the darkest nights at Newman Enterprises or the most vicious battles with his enemies, could have prepared him for the shattering blow that slammed into him the moment he discovered Nikki's indirect secret with Jack Abbott, a secret so quietly woven, so delicately concealed, that it somehow cut deeper than any overt affair or blatant betrayal, because what he uncovered was not simply a moment of weakness or a whispered lie but an emotional entanglement built on secrecy, trust, and choices made behind closed doors, choices that stabbed directly at the heart of everything Victor believed he had rebuilt with Nikki after years of fighting, forgiving, and clawing their way back to each other. The revelation began subtly, almost innocently, with a set of inconsistencies that Victor at first dismissed as stress, the usual whirlwind chaos of life in Genoa City, where everyone often seemed one confession or crisis away from spiraling into a meltdown, and Nikki, his beloved wife, had certainly been under enormous pressure lately, supporting Victoria through personal heartbreak, worrying about Nick's growing distance from the family, and quietly managing her own battles while serving as the glue holding the Newman name together, or so Victor believed, until the moment certain details began aligning in a way that forced him to confront a truth he never expected to face, and at the center of it stood Jack Abbott, the man Victor had fought for decades, the rival he had sparred with over business, love, and pride, the man who, despite their rare moments of civility, would always be tied to one of the deepest fault lines in the foundation of the Newman marriage. But this time it wasn't the type of scandal Victor once feared. Not romantic touches behind the scenes, not secret rendezvous, not an emotional affair in the classic sense, but something far more insidious. Nikki had been confiding in Jack, leaning on him in a private, emotional, and deeply personal way, sharing fears, vulnerabilities, and stories that should have been told to her husband, not to the one man Victor had long warned her to keep at a distance. The betrayal in Victor's eyes came not from passion but from secrecy, from conversations cloaked in familiarity, from the comfort Jack provided during a period when Nikki seemed increasingly fragile and withdrawn, something Victor attributed to her health or stress, never suspecting that Jack had been quietly stepping into a space Victor believed was solely his to occupy. The truth struck Victor not with the brute force of an explosive scandal, but with a cold, creeping devastation that hollowed him out from the inside, because emotional trust was the one currency Victor valued above all others, and to learn that Nikki had spent weeks, perhaps months, turning to Jack at moments of fear, anxiety, and doubt, rather than to her husband, was enough to send a quiet fury simmering beneath his calm exterior. It began when Victor overheard a seemingly innocent comment from Diane, who in her attempt to appear casual had inadvertently planted the seed that would soon erupt into a devastating realization, mentioning that Jack had been such a good friend to Nikki lately, and that they had been spending a surprising amount of time talking about things she considered deeply personal, a remark that, under any other circumstance, Victor might have ignored, but something about Diane's tone stuck with him, and the next morning, Victor found himself arriving at the ranch earlier than expected after a meeting was cancelled, only to discover Nikki hurriedly ending a call, her voice trembling ever so slightly as she told the person on the other end she would talk later. Before hanging up the phone with a guilty stiffness Victor had seen too many times in others not to recognize instantly. When he asked who it was, Nikki replied with a soft, evasive, "Just someone checking in." But Victor felt the truth lingering beneath her hesitation, and for the first time in months the old suspicion, the one he thought he'd buried forever, flickered back to life. Not because he believed Nikki was unfaithful, but because he sensed she was hiding something, shielding someone, or protecting a truth she was terrified to unleash. But the tipping point came when Victor visited Jabot unexpectedly, intending to speak with Kyle about a minor corporate conflict, only to overhear Jack in his office, speaking on the phone in a tone that was too gentle, too familiar, too affectionate for comfort, saying, "I'm here whenever you need me, even if you can't say things to him." A statement that triggered a raw, instinctive reaction inside Victor, one that made him pause, listen, take in every word Jack said, each phrase tightening a knot in Victor's chest. Especially when Jack added, "You don't have to face this alone, Nikki," confirming Victor's worst fear. Nikki had been confiding in Jack about something significant, something she couldn't or wouldn't share with him, After Jack ended the call, Victor stepped into the doorway, and the look Jack gave him was enough to reveal that Jack instantly knew Victor had heard every word. The air between them thickened, charged with decades of rivalry and mistrust, and Victor, with a voice eerily calm, simply asked, "What exactly is it that my wife feels she can't tell me?" But Jack, perhaps for once trying to choose caution over battle, replied that it wasn't his place to say, which only enraged Victor more, because nothing fueled his fury like being shut out of matters involving Nikki's well-being, and Jack's refusal became the spark that ignited the wildfire of suspicion, anger, and fear raging inside him. For days afterward, Victor tried to get Nikki to tell him the truth, but each time, she dodged the conversation, claiming she was fine, that everything was handled, that he didn't need to worry. But Victor, whose entire life had been built on reading enemies, allies, and family members alike, knew that something enormous was simmering under the surface, something that frightened Nikki enough that she turned to Jack instead of him. Finally, the revelation came in the most painful way possible, not through honesty, not through confession, but through accidental discovery. Victor found a series of messages Nikki had drafted but never sent, fragments of thoughts, fears, and personal confessions she clearly intended to share with Jack. Notes discussing her fear of relapse, her guilt over certain decisions, her struggle to maintain control at social events, her anxiety surrounding Victoria's turbulent life, and something else even deeper. Doubts about whether she could open up to Victor without disappointing him. Doubts about whether he would see her struggles as weakness, doubts rooted not in lack of love but in fear of judgment, fear that Victor, ever the titan, ever the problem solver, would try to fix her instead of simply listening, a fear Nikki had never expressed aloud, not even during their most vulnerable conversations. Reading her words tore Victor apart, because in them he saw not betrayal but pain, yet the devastation remained because Nikki had chosen Jack, of all people, to hold those fears. He confronted her that evening, hands trembling not in anger but in heartbreak, demanding to know why she turned to a man he had fought for decades instead of the husband who had stood by her through every storm. Nikki, overwhelmed, confessed everything, that she never intended to deceive him, that she only spoke to Jack because she feared burdening Victor during a time he was dealing with major business crises, that Jack offered a quiet space where she could speak without feeling like she was disappointing the Newman patriarch, that she hadn't realized how deep the secrecy had become until it was too late and she didn't know how to undo it. She insisted it wasn't romantic, wasn't emotional in the sense Victor feared, but rather a safe outlet. Yet even that explanation sliced Victor open, because the idea that his wife, his partner, the woman he built an empire with, believed she couldn't turn to him was a blow to his pride, his heart, and his identity as her protector. His voice cracked as he told her, "You are the one person I never want to be shut out by." And Nikki broke down, apologizing repeatedly, insisting she never meant to hurt him, but Victor, devastated, withdrew into a quiet, dangerous introspection, questioning how they had reached a point where Jack Abbott, his sworn rival, had become the guardian of Nikki's most private fears. The fallout sent shockwaves across Genoa City, with Victoria furious at Jack for crossing emotional boundaries, Nick stunned by the intensity of his father's pain, and Diane secretly gleeful at the strain now forming between the Newmans and the Abbotts. The entire city began whispering about whether Victor and Nikki could recover from a betrayal built not on passion but on emotional trust, the very foundation of their marriage, and whether Victor, for all his power and impenetrable strength, could forgive a wound inflicted not by an enemy but by the woman he cherished more than his own legacy. In the days that followed, Victor wrestled with a mix of pride, sorrow, and fear, uncertain whether the marriage he fought so hard to preserve could withstand this new and devastating fracture, while Nikki struggled with guilt so heavy it threatened to consume her, desperate to prove to Victor that her heart had never strayed, that her trust in Jack had been a moment of weakness, not a replacement for the bond she shared with her husband. But the question lingered, a question that would shape their next chapter on The Young and the Restless. Can Victor forgive a betrayal not of the body, not of the heart, but of the soul? And can Nikki regain the trust she didn't even realize she had lost until the moment it shattered before her eyes? Victor Newman had survived wars both corporate and personal, but the days following Nikki's emotional confession carved into him in ways even he, the legendary titan of Genoa City, could not have predicted, for the wound was not loud or dramatic but deep, quiet, and relentless, the kind of hurt that seeped into the bones and clung like a shadow that refused to be shaken. And although Victor tried to maintain his customary iron posture, Shoulders squared, chin high, voice steady, the cracks beneath the surface widened with every silent dinner, every hesitant touch. Every night he lay awake staring at the ceiling of the ranch bedroom where countless memories of passion, heartbreak, reconciliation, and devotion lingered like ghosts whispering of the empire he'd built not just with money but with love. Yet now that empire trembled, not from a hostile takeover or a boardroom ambush, but from something far more dangerous, doubt, the silent parasite that fed on the heart and clouded everything in its path. And as Victor drifted through his days with the demeanor of a man haunted by the impossibility of what he had discovered, that his wife, his strength, his partner through the darkest storms, had sought emotional refuge in the arms of Jack Abbott, not romantically, not physically, but trustingly, intimately, vulnerably. He found himself questioning every assumption he had ever held about their marriage, about the unbreakable bond he thought they'd reforged after decades of mistakes, betrayals, reconciliations, and renewals of vows. Even the simplest memories, Nikki laughing over breakfast, Nikki squeezing his hand at family dinners, Nikki whispering "I love you" before sleep, now felt fragile, tinged with the knowledge that there were moments, private moments, where she felt safer confiding in someone else, someone who wasn't him, someone who had been his enemy more often than not. And as Victor grappled with the silent ache tearing through him, Nikki struggled, in her own quiet turmoil, to repair a wound she couldn't quite see the edges of, for she knew she had hurt Victor in a way that words alone could not mend, and each time she reached for him, tentatively, apologetically, she felt him stiffen, not out of anger but out of fear, as if he didn't know what to do with her closeness anymore, as if touching her reopened a bruise that hadn't yet healed. In these days the Newman Ranch, usually filled with the comforting hum of stability, felt cold, sterile, and hollow, with Nikki drifting through hallways like a ghost carrying the weight of every unspoken apology, and Victor moving with the quiet intensity of a man preparing for an emotional war he was terrified of losing. Their children noticed immediately, of course. Victoria cornered Nikki at Crimson Lights, asking sharply why her mother looked like she'd spent every night crying, while Nick approached Victor in the office and tried to coax him into talking, only to be met with tight-lipped silence. But neither parent could bring themselves to speak the full truth, for how could Nikki admit to her children that she had inadvertently breached the sacred trust of her marriage, and how could Victor confess that Jack Abbott had been the one wielding emotional influence over the woman he loved? The irony cut him deeply. He, Victor Newman, the man who had taken down giants, who had faced down Adam in his darkest phases, who had outmaneuvered Ashland Locke and countless predators, now found himself undone not by a rival's scheme but by his own wife's moment of vulnerability. It was this contradiction that tormented him the most, the feeling that he should have been strong enough to prevent it, attentive enough to see Nikki's fear before she felt forced to shield it from him, compassionate enough to listen without making her feel judged. Yet instead she had gone to Jack, the one man Victor had always warned her about, the one man whose presence in her emotional life represented everything Victor fought against: chaos, unpredictability, and the constant threat of being replaced. Though Nikki insisted repeatedly that she had never intended to replace Victor with Jack, that her confessions had been moments of weakness rather than deliberate choices, the image of Jack's gentle tone, "You don't have to face this alone," echoed in Victor's mind like a taunt, a reminder of the emotional territory he had failed to protect. And while Nikki attempted to rebuild the bridge with quiet gestures, cooking his favorite meals, lingering in doorways hoping he would invite her in, resting her hand on his arm when they passed each other, nothing pierced the wall Victor had subconsciously erected, because his devastation wasn't fury-driven but rooted in heartbreak, a hollowing grief that made him feel older than he had in years, as though someone had chipped away at the foundation of his identity itself. His pain became even more visible during the stormy night when he found himself in his study, staring at an old photograph of him and Nikki from a past vow renewal, the two of them smiling with such warmth, such undiluted certainty, that it felt like a cruel reminder of everything they stood to lose. In that moment the question he had been avoiding forced itself to the surface. Was love enough to overcome a betrayal not of fidelity but of trust? He did not know, and that terrified him. Meanwhile, Jack found himself trapped in a nightmare of his own making, for though he had done nothing intentionally inappropriate, nothing romantic or morally ambiguous, the optics of the situation were undeniably destructive, and every time he saw Victor in public, whether at society galas, at Jabot board meetings, or even in passing outside society, he could feel the seething silence radiating from the other man, A silence far more dangerous than rage. For Victor's anger when spoken could be confronted, but his quiet withdrawal signaled a level of pain Jack had not anticipated. Even Diane noticed, urging Jack to keep his distance, whispering that Nikki should resolve her marriage without Jack hovering at the edges like a reminder of the wound. And though Jack agreed intellectually, he couldn't help the instinct to check on Nikki, especially when he saw her alone at the jazz lounge one evening, clutching a club soda with trembling fingers, her eyes glossy with unshed tears. But when he approached her, Nikki shook her head, whispering, "Not now please Jack, not now," before leaving the lounge in a rush, a moment that left Jack standing there, feeling as though he had been punched in the stomach, for the last thing he'd ever wanted was to be the reason Nikki's marriage buckled. Yet, despite everything, the emotional distance between Victor and Nikki only grew, and with each passing day, Victor found himself revisiting memories of the past, Nikki's past struggles, their past separations, their past years apart, and wondering whether he had failed her in ways he hadn't seen, whether he had been too consumed by business, by protecting Newman Enterprises, by controlling the world around him, to notice the subtle tremors in Nikki's emotional foundation. And Nikki in turn found herself revisiting every fear she had ever held about her marriage, every moment she felt she had disappointed Victor, every instance where she believed he viewed her through the lens of someone needing to be fixed, not understood. These unspoken insecurities created a chasm so vast that even the simplest interaction became charged with tension. Nikki reaching for Victor's hand during a Newman family dinner only for him to gently pull away under the pretense of checking his phone. Victor stepping into their room at night and pausing before lying beside her, as if unsure whether he belonged in the same bed. Nikki crying quietly in the bathroom, stifling the sound so Victor wouldn't hear. And Victor staring at her reflection through the mirror, wishing he could bridge the distance but unable to do so without confronting the raw ache inside him. The breaking point came unexpectedly, during a Newman family meeting where Victor attempted to discuss a new business merger but found himself distracted, stumbling over words, a rarity that instantly alarmed the room. And when Nikki placed a hand on his shoulder to steady him, he flinched, not intentionally but reflexively, and the entire family fell silent, watching the tremor of pain ripple across Nikki's face. After the meeting, Nikki left without a word and Victor, for the first time in years, felt completely powerless, as though the emotional devastation had finally breached the armor he had spent decades forging. That night he found himself wandering the ranch grounds alone, the cold wind cutting against his face, and for the first time since discovering her secret, he allowed himself to cry, not out of anger, not out of betrayal, but out of profound aching sadness because despite everything, he still loved Nikki with every fiber of his being, and the thought of losing her, even emotionally, terrified him more than any enemy he had ever faced. It was in this moment of vulnerability that Nikki emerged from the house, wrapped in a blanket, her eyes red but determined, and she approached him cautiously, as though afraid he might disappear if she got too close. But Victor, seeing her silhouette trembling in the moonlight, felt something inside him shift, not forgiveness, not complete understanding, but the soft ache of recognition, that Nikki too had been suffering, had been drowning in guilt, had been desperate to fix what she broke, and as she whispered, "I miss you. I miss us," Victor closed his eyes, exhaled shakily, and allowed her fingers to brush against his hand, a small gesture that carried the weight of decades. And though the chasm between them remained vast, this moment, their first thread of reconnection, signaled that healing, however slow, however painful, was still possible, that their love, though battered, had not yet shattered beyond repair. Yet even in this fragile moment, the lingering question remained. Could Victor truly forgive? Could Nikki truly heal? And would Jack's shadow ever fully disappear from the edges of their marriage? Only time, unforgiving, relentless time, would decide the future of the Newmans. But even as Victor and Nikki stood together beneath the cold sweep of the night sky, fingers barely intertwined, both of them knew this tiny spark of reconnection was only the beginning of a long, painful climb back toward trust, because the wound Nikki had unintentionally inflicted ran deeper than either of them dared acknowledge aloud. Over the next few days, Victor found himself watching her with a quiet, contemplative intensity, not suspicious, not resentful but wounded, studying the way her smile faltered when she thought he wasn't looking, the way she hesitated before speaking, the way she hovered near him as though hoping he might invite her into a world she feared she'd been exiled from. And Nikki, sensing every shift in his breathing, every pause in his gaze, refused to hide from the consequences of her choices, determined to prove through her actions, not just apologies, That Victor was the only man she trusted with her soul, even if she had momentarily wavered under the weight of her fears. Yet the specter of Jack still lingered unspoken between them, a shadow neither of them addressed directly, because both knew that to heal fully, they would eventually have to confront that name, that connection, and the emotional truths it exposed.